Thank you for joining us today for our Consumer Credit Scores webinar. We'll start with a quick reminder of what we're referring to when we use the term credit. The first thing that comes to mind for many people would be credit cards and loans, either installment loans, such as mortgages and car financing, or revolving loans, such as lines of credit. Don't forget about service credit, such as a cell phone plan where the consumer is billed at the end of the month for their activity that month. This can also be considered a form of credit. Let's take a look at how credit information typically gets used. We've got a consumer here on the left side. We'll call him Jerry. Jerry has a credit card, a cell phone plan, a car loan, and a mortgage. When Jerry applied for each of these accounts, the lender or service provider had to make a decision about how risky it would be to take Jerry on as a customer. Would he pay his bills? Would he end up defaulting and causing the lender or service provider to lose money? They often get information from Equifax in order to help them make this decision in the form of credit scores and or information from his credit file. We'll get into more detail on that shortly. After Jerry was approved for these accounts and he started paying the monthly bills, the lenders and service providers, which you can see in the middle of this picture, began to report the information on his payments to the credit bureaus on the right of the page. This data is recorded in Jerry's credit history. There are two credit bureaus in Canada, Equifax and TransUnion. Typically, lenders and service providers would report this information to both bureaus, and Jerry would have a credit history at both bureaus. Companies like lenders that access credit files can only do so for specific reasons, like the consumer has applied for new credit. In these cases, the consumer must give permission to the lender to access their credit file. There are some exceptions for law enforcement purposes, but otherwise, no one can access your credit file without your permission. Generally, lenders and other organizations that access credit files will get the credit information they need from one bureau or the other, but not both. Now we're going to take a look at the information that's typically on a credit file. There are a lot of terms that get used interchangeably here. There's a difference between a credit history and a credit score, but we often use one term when we actually mean the other. When we're talking about all the credit-related information about a particular individual at Equifax, we are referring to that person's credit file, credit report, or credit history. These terms generally mean the same thing. Sometimes a lender talks about pulling a person's bureau. This is what they're referring to. There are a few key categories of information on an individual's credit file. Of course, we need identification information to ensure that we've got the data matched to the right person. We are required by law to record any access to an individual's credit file, whether it was a credit check because the person applied for a mortgage or a new rental apartment, or they requested a copy of their own file from Equifax directly. It must be logged on the file. This log is called the inquiry section of the file. Each access of the credit file is logged as an inquiry. There are two main types of inquiries, those that are related to the consumer seeking new credit and those that aren't. Credit-seeking inquiries are called hard inquiries and have the potential to affect the consumer's credit score. We'll talk more about the impact of hard inquiries on credit scores later in this presentation. Examples of these inquiries would be when the consumer applies for a new credit card or loan. The other main category of inquiries is soft inquiries, and they are logged when the credit file is accessed for non-credit seeking purposes. An example of a soft inquiry would be a pre-employment check, where the individual has a job offer that is contingent on a credit check. Consent is still required from the individual to access their credit file. However, since they aren't actively seeking credit, this type of inquiry is considered soft. Another example of a soft inquiry would be when the individual gets a copy of his or her own credit file. The access to the credit file must be logged even though it was the person looking at their own file. There is a misconception that every time you check your own credit file, your credit score goes down. This is not the case. Checking your own credit history results in a soft inquiry on the file, and only a hard inquiry may have an effect on the score. Note that I said may. We'll get to that shortly. Continuing to look at this simplified view of a credit file, we have the public records section. This is where financially related public records may appear. If the individual had an account that went into collections, that information would typically appear in the public records section. If an individual has declared bankruptcy, it would generally appear here as well. The public records section also lists any financial judgments against the person, for example, unpaid taxes. The final section we'll look at on the credit file is where the bulk of the data typically resides. This is where the information about each of the accounts appears. We tend to refer to each account as a trade, and the details about it appear in the trade line. You may recall our example consumer Jerry, whom we met on the previous slide. Jerry had 4 accounts: a credit card, a mobile phone, a car loan, and a mortgage. Each of these would correspond to a trade line on his credit file. So Jerry's credit file would have 4 trade lines. Each account gets updated individually according to when the lender or service provider reports that data to Equifax. Most trade lines are updated monthly. Using Jerry's credit card trade line as an example, it would show his credit limit, current balance, amount of last payment, and current rating. The rating is a letter and a number describing the type of trade, R for revolving in this case, and the status. The 1 is the best status, generally indicating the account is paid as agreed. So Jerry would actually have 4 credit ratings, 1 for each of his trade lines. Of course, he could be up to date on one account and behind in payments on a different account. People often use the term credit rating when they actually mean credit score. We've looked at the key sections on a credit file. What's the difference between a credit file and a credit score? The short answer is that the credit file contains the details, and a credit score is meant to provide a quick snapshot of the details. It's a 3-digit number between 300 and 900. Credit scores were originally developed to help risk managers at lenders like banks make a decision about whether or not to loan money to someone. Credit scores offer an objective measure of risk, which is often used in conjunction with other information about an applicant in order to make a decision about whether or not to approve their application and under what terms. Let's dig into that a bit more. It says here that a credit score is not an evaluation of past performance. Why is that? They are actually designed to be predictive of future performance. What's the difference? Think about a weather report. When you hear a weather report, you are often told about the current conditions, but also what is likely to happen over the next 24 hours. We hear about the likelihood of precipitation. It's a forecast of what's likely to happen based on current conditions and a statistical analysis of what tends to happen in this area under similar conditions. It's a similar idea behind credit scores. They predict future performance based on current circumstances using a statistical analysis of what tends to happen under similar conditions. So what are we trying to predict with credit scores? We're trying to predict the likelihood that someone will pay their bills. We can't comment on their ability to pay their bills because, as you'll recall from our walkthrough of the credit file data, we don't have information on an individual's assets on their credit file. For example, the credit file does not contain bank account balances or information about their wealth, financial holdings, for example. This is one of the reasons that a credit score is often only one of the factors that a lender might use to make a lending decision. For something like a mortgage, a lender is probably going to look at an applicant's income, employment status, and other information in order to make a lending decision. The bottom part of this slide shows a couple of different views of the credit score, what the consumer might see and what a lender might see. Lenders typically see what we call reason codes along with the score itself. They are intended to describe the 3 to 4 most negative elements in the individual's credit file that had a negative impact on their score. In other words, what drove the score down. However, the IT specifications of the systems do not allow these fields to be blank, so even people with the best scores in the country are going to have some negative statements here. They need to be interpreted with context. You can see the consumer view is much more friendly on the right side. This is a mock-up of what might be shown to the consumer. As more and more options become available to consumers for accessing their scores, there may be different views of this information. I'm going to introduce another layer of complexity now. There are multiple scores used by different lenders and organizations, and they're not all the same. You may have heard of FICO scores. There are also Equifax proprietary scores. They all have the same purpose, as we've already discussed. They are all designed to predict the likelihood that an individual will pay their financial obligations. They have some differences, just like different brands of ranch salad dressing in a grocery store might have similar ingredients in a slightly different order. In the case of scores, some of the elements of a credit file might carry more weight in one score version compared to another. I know you're eager to hear about what those elements of the credit file are, and we're getting there. The key message here is that each one of us has multiple scores. We tend to think in terms of my credit score. Will applying for a credit card affect my credit score, for example? Well, sometimes it depends on which score you're talking about. Many people don't realize that if they walk into a bank branch and apply for a mortgage, and then walk across the street to a competing bank and apply for a mortgage to see where they can get the better rate, those two banks may well be seeing different scores for that individual. In this example on the slide, one bank might see that a person is a 725, while another bank sees a 737. No one score is more correct than another. They are just the result of slightly different scoring algorithms. This situation isn't new. There have always been multiple score versions available in the market and used by different institutions. Now the general awareness of this is increasing as consumers get better access to this information, which is a good thing. Now we're going to discuss how new score algorithms are developed. First, let's talk about why new score algorithms are developed. I mean, if we have a credit score that is doing a pretty good job of predicting the likelihood that a consumer will pay their bills, why would we need to create a new score version? There are typically two reasons that we would decide to create a new score. One is that new data may become available in the Bureau that wasn't previously available, and the use of this data will improve the predictive power of the score. An example is that there was a time when mortgage-related trade lines weren't reported to the bureaus. Mortgage lenders were concerned that other lenders might try to poach their customers who were coming up for renewal if the other lender happened to get a copy of the customer's credit file for another reason. If the other lender could see the consumer's mortgage was, say, 4.5 years old and still had a fairly large balance, then they might be renewing soon, since 5-year terms are very common. The other lender might start marketing heavily to that consumer in order to get them to switch mortgage lenders upon renewal. Eventually, the mortgage lenders came to an agreement about reporting mortgage trade lines with certain elements of the data being masked in order to limit the opportunity for poaching clients. So there were a number of credit scores that had been developed without taking into account mortgage data, and now mortgage data is available. You can't just shove new data in an algorithm that wasn't designed to incorporate it. It's a little bit like trying to add another egg to a cake which is already baked. You have to start fresh with a new cake in order to include the egg. New scores had to be developed in order to take into account mortgage data in this case. There are still older score versions used by lenders today that don't include mortgage data. They just ignore any mortgage trade lines on the consumer's credit file. So that's one of the reasons we might develop a new score, the availability of new data in the Bureau. Another reason we might develop a new score algorithm is when consumer behavior changes. Over time, Canadian consumers have become more comfortable carrying larger amounts of debt. So an older score version might put a higher weight on high balances, while a new score version might not. Okay, we've talked about why we might develop a new score version. Now let's talk about how we go about it. So we make the decision to create a new scoring algorithm. That's the red dotted line circle on this slide. We start by going back in time a couple of years, and we take several million Canadians' credit files from a single point in time, let's say July 2016. They're anonymized, of course, so there are no privacy issues. We get a good cross-section of credit files, people who have long, clean credit histories, people who have recently declared bankruptcy, and everything in between. You can see that first group of credit files on the timeline. Then we take those same people's credit files 12 months later, so that would be July 2017. That's represented by the second group of credit files on the timeline. We look at what changed from the first sample to the second. Some people will have declared bankruptcy or started to make later payments. Others will have climbed out of a bankruptcy situation, and so on. Here's the big question. What did we know about these people in 2016 that turned out to be most predictive of what actually happened in 2017? In other words, what information on a credit file is most predictive of future payment behavior? Our statisticians then start to group people who tend to behave similarly. For example, they might find that people who have shorter credit histories tend to demonstrate certain behavior patterns, and people who have longer, more established credit histories tend to demonstrate different behavior patterns. They might find that people who have something derogatory on their credit files, such as a previous bankruptcy or items in collections, tend to behave differently from people who don't have something derogatory on their credit files. Ultimately, we end up with several different groups or segments of the Canadian population. Each one of these groups gets a different score algorithm. Different elements of the credit files can be weighted differently in the score calculation, depending on which segment the individual falls into. Let's walk through an example. We talked earlier about how hard inquiries on the credit file might have an impact on the score. Let's say you and I both have a score of 720, but we fall into different segments. I might have some late payments on my file, and you don't. So our scores got calculated differently, but we both landed at a 720. Then on the same day, we both go and apply for a new credit card. So both of our files get a new hard inquiry from that credit application. The next time our scores are calculated, my score might have gone down a little because in my segment, hard inquiries on the credit file carry a higher weight, and your score may have stayed the same because the additional hard inquiry didn't really affect your score calculation. On the previous slide, we looked at how there are many different score versions in the market today, and we're talking about just one score version here. Each score is made up of multiple algorithms like I've just described, which means that it is absolutely impossible to answer one of the most common questions we get. How will it affect my score if I apply for new credit? Well, it depends on who will be calculating the score, which score version they use, and which segment of the population you fall into at the time your score is calculated. Finally, we've arrived at what actually goes into a credit score calculation. Now that you know all the layers of complexity behind credit scores, you can understand why these are high-level approximations, not exact numbers. It turns out that payment history is the most predictive characteristic on a credit file. So past payment behavior tends to have the heaviest weight in credit score calculations. This includes items like number and severity of past due items. The next factor is utilization. This is the percentage of available credit that is actually being used. If someone has a credit card with a $10,000 limit and they currently have a balance of $5,000, they would be at 50% utilization for that account, since they are using half of the available credit. Don't misinterpret this to say that 30% utilization is the ideal amount to aim for. That's not what this is illustrating. This is saying that about 30% of the credit score calculation comes from the utilization calculations from the credit file. This raises the common question, what is the ideal percentage utilization? Again, there is no definitive answer for this because there are so many factors involved in the calculation. Next, we have the length of credit history. This is how long the credit file has been open. The fourth common factor in credit score calculations is the mix of credit products. Does the individual have experience with different types of credit? Finally, we have the hard inquiries. They can make up about 10% of the overall calculation. Again, don't misinterpret this to think that since inquiries are worth 10% of the score, or your score drops by 10% every time there's a new hard inquiry on your file. This is the part of the discussion where people start to panic and wonder, how can I ever maximize my score when it's all so complicated and I don't know what to do? Here's the bottom line. Scores are designed to predict the likelihood that you will pay your bills on time. The big secret to a good credit score is simply to pay your bills and pay them on time. Even making the minimum payment on a credit card by the due date is still keeping up your end of the bargain. That's what you signed up for when you got the card. It is almost impossible to game the score, especially because it depends on what you're applying for, where, which score they use, and so on. Also, the score is often only one of the pieces of information that goes into a credit adjudication decision because, as we've discussed, it does not necessarily illustrate the full picture. Thank you for joining us today. We've also included an appendix for further information.